evening and welcome to another fascinating episode of the Chocolate Box Presents. I'm your host, Chocolate Drop. Yep, and as usual, you're in for a fascinating program. Tonight, I am delighted, I am ecstatic, I'm over the moon to have my brother from another mother, as they say, Mr. Adrian Sundiata, as my guest on the Chocolate Box. So welcome to the program.
Beautiful, yeah. Thank you for having me.
Beautiful, beautiful. Listen, I wanted to do a follow-up because you and I got a chance to kind of get reconnected with a presentation that you did a couple of weeks back, you know, and just, you can kind of know someone, but then you get a chance to see them do what they do, and you're like, wow, I didn't realize I was in the presence of greatness. That was the experience I had.
I appreciate it, brother.
All right. And the subject matter was dealing with black men, and like the title of this program is Cultivating Boys to Men, or Cultivating Black Boys to Men. I wanted to use that as a title because the one word that you used in your presentation was cultivation culture. Tell me, what does that word mean to you, cultivate and culture?
Got it. So the presentation was about a term that I've coined called culturally responsible manhood. Mm-hmm. So it's about looking at culture, it's looking at manhood through a cultural lens. And so culture for me, borrowing from Marimbe Ani and Dr. Amos and Wilson, and combining heavyweights, combining two of the things they taught me about culture. And culture is there to solve the problems of the culture group and meet the needs of the culture group. So if a culture does not solve your problem or meet your needs, then it may not be your culture. Then we got into the conversation about culture being rooted in the word cultivate.
Okay, as in to grow.
As in to grow, nurture. So it must nurture you, it must grow you, it must make you bigger, stronger, and better.
And if it does not do that,
it's not your culture.
It's not your culture.
Yeah.
So one of the reference material books you referenced was The Miseducation of the Negro.
Yes.
It's a seminal book by Carter G.
Absolutely.
Woodson. Talk
Critical
to us about
must
how
read.
important that book is.
Absolutely. So we've done shows on it. You remember?
Yes,
we have done shows on it.
To try to give him his props, because a lot of people don't know who he is.
One of the misnomers is that I think that to set the stage for that is what Carter G. Woodson talked about, how long, I think he told, it took him like 30 years to uneducate himself and re-educate himself from all of the schooling he had received up until his moment of cultural awareness. And so just think about that, right? So he went through all these levels of higher education, doctor, and realized that I've been miseducated and educated away from my true culture, away from my true identity, and now I must re-educate myself. And so oftentimes those who come through academia do more to misinform and misguide our culture group than they do to aid it, help it, especially towards liberation.
And if you kind of extrapolate that even further, imagine those people end up, some of them in their 70s, 80s, 90s, having been teachers, schools, principals, with that same level of miseducation.
Leading institutions.
Down to the people that they taught.
Whole new generations being miseducated, misguided, misinformed. And so it's important that as we go through this conversation, one thing I want to impress upon us that has to be a part of our culture is the ability to think correctly, to analyze information, to have evidence-based information when forming our opinions or giving direction to a group of people. Where is the evidence of what you're saying? What supports it? And have you done any critical analysis to determine whether that holds up on the weight or not? Too many times we hear things and we run with it and never really examine it. I give you an example of that is the idea of this $1 trillion of spending power that the black community has, right? So we've been running with that for decades, and it's just not true. So good brother Dr. Jared Ball has recently put out a book. Dr. Jared Ball. Put out a book. It has a free PDF of the book for those who don't want to, purchase it. But he has a free copy. It's called Propaganda and the Myth of Black Spending Power.
Okay, propaganda and the myth of black spending power.
Yeah, so this idea that somewhere there's an account, this black account holding trillions of dollars just ready. But think about this. No other cultural group determines its value by its ability to consume. Spending power.
That's a whole nother conversation.
That's the difference.
Like that.
Just even that,
but
right?
Worthy
Alone.
of program.
Yeah. So just even that. But this idea that we have trillions of dollars, you know as well as I know, what you make and what you come home with.
Two totally different things.
Two different things. Now, once it gets home, what it's now obligated to, right? So there's a study that says that poor and impoverished people spend 30% of their net on power, electricity.
Almost
30% of their net.
Yeah.
Of their net. Yeah. So that's a 30% of what you brought home now leaving out. So then when we redo the math on what we actually what we actually get to keep.
And depending on what you get to keep is what you
can
do.
Idea of trillions of dollars. But then
income.
But we ran with it.
Yeah.
So many people have said it as trying to use it as a motivating factor to get black people to organize their dollars towards liberation.
Well, I like the way you said earlier about asking questions, and that's one of the things that Neely Fuller Jr., who's the author of a book we're both familiar with, talks about just always being that question category, asking why. Why. More and more people ask why, as in Carter G. Woodson said, "Why? How can I be a doctor and I'm still miseducated?"
Being illogical.
I neglected to start off this particular interview with the word Pan-Africanism, and you choose to identify yourself as a Pan-Africanist. Is that correct?
Pan-Africanist, nationalist, revolutionary.
Okay. Break that down to make it plain to our viewers.
So Pan-Africanism is the idea of you're African wherever you are in the world. That you don't have to be born in Africa. That Africa is born in you. That you identify that your point of origin in the world is the continent of Africa.
Throughout the diaspora.
So that's the simplest explanation for Pan-Africanism. When you add nationalism into it, it's the efforts of a ideology that wants to create a global African superstate, meaning that all 54 states of Africa become one, to include the islands of the Caribbeans and the British West Indies and the Americas, where African people populate, become a part of an African global superstate.
Throughout the diaspora. No matter where, as long as you got that melanin.
As long as you, and organize, not just having it. Organizing it towards African independence and sovereignty.
That mind.
Yeah.
That mind. So who are some of the famous, let's say, more household names that people may be familiar with, who also embrace that term Pan-Africanist?
So if you go with household, you know that one of our greatest examples, Marcus Mosiah Garvey, will be one of those. Wally Malcolm X was a Pan-Africanist, though I can't say that he ever spoke those words in identifying himself, but through practice,
yes,
he was a Pan-Africanist. And so when you look at, God, you say household, depending on who household you're talking about.
That's true too, yeah.
There's some common names in my household versus maybe some other households. But when
you name at least two of the ones I think most people have heard of.
Absolutely.
How does black people in America, knowing our history, affect our abilities of breaking the mental shackles of racism, white supremacy? Just knowing who, not only say who we are, but whose we are. How does that help to correct the miseducation?
Yeah. So I want to stress that a little further. It's not just about, it's about knowing history. The fact that we have to isolate our history speaks to the atrocity that was done to us. That if you properly study world history and putting Africans back into world history, then you can then analyze what must be done. See, until you critically understand what happened, till you truly understand the problem, what caused the problem, you can't come up with you can't to reverse engineer it. And so you have to understand. That's why Urugu, let's see, I thought I saw it up here somewhere, but the book Urugu by Marin Bayani, Urugu.
Okay.
She gave us a critical analysis of Eurocentric behavior and cultural, what she calls cultural asili. And so understanding that the behavior of Europeans and what motivates them now gives you the capacity to know how to counter some of those behaviors, and also not to adopt those. Then you can see those behaviors in yourself and then identify where those behaviors come. Because what Dr. W.E.B. Nobles taught us is that when you take on another people's culture, you also take on their pathologies.
Because again, if it's not your culture, it's not helping you to grow.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Growing from a young man, as it says, cultivating black boys to men. In that presentation that we talked about earlier, you spoke very highly of your grandfather.
Yes, sir.
And the impact that he had on your life. Talk to us a little about this man who you still revere to this day.
Albert Blair Smith Sr., Goldsboro, North Carolina, 1133 Olivia Lane.
Okay.
Right. So my grandfather once lived in a 2-room house. And they say 2-bedroom.
Two rooms.
Right. One of the rooms was a bedroom where my mother and her siblings, girl siblings, and my grandmother slept. The other room was an open room with a potbelly heater, the kitchen and everything else that came with it, where my grandfather slept in a chair most of the time, and my uncle, who is junior, slept on a couch.
Now, what year are we talking about here?
We're talking 50s, right? 50s. So he started building his home in 1955.
Okay.
And so he told my grandmother, Lizzie, that's what he called her name was Elizabeth, Lizzie, I'm going to get you out this house. I'm going to build you a house. So he went into a bank, and my grandfather had what was then a 3rd grade education, but my grandfather was functionally illiterate, could barely read or write. And he did a blueprint he drew himself and took this blueprint into the bank, asked the bank for a loan to build a home. The bank declined him for a loan because he was building a house right across the street from government housing projects, right? And so they said, we can't give you a loan to build a house this big on that side of town. So my grandfather told me, you can keep your money. And it took him 4 years just working on the house on Saturdays for 4 years to finalize a home for my grandmother that's now a little over 3,000 square foot ranch style home, beautiful.
That he built.
Craftsmanship out of this world. I recently took a GC friend of mine down
GC
there.
General Contractor.
General Contractor,
Okay.
yes, sir. Down there to look at doing some repairs and things to the home, and he was just astonished. He was like, "This is solid. This house not going anywhere." And he started noticing the details of craftsmanship. Well, my grandfather, primarily was he farmed, he hunted, he cut hair, and he was a craftsman. And so
And this is with a 3rd grade education.
This is with a 3rd, and he used to sit down every evening at that table. He would sit by himself after the family ate, and after dinner, my grandmother would sit at the dinner table and teach him how to read and write. But my grandfather was more adamant about counting his money than getting the words spelled right. So they say, make sure they don't beat me out no money, Lizzie.
You shared something else. You were saying how your grandmother selected him for a particular reason.
Absolutely. So I found this out just having a conversation about love. And my aunts and mother and sisters and everyone was having this conversation about relationships and love. And my grandmother had this look on her face. She was like, I didn't love your granddaddy when I married him. She said, I didn't marry him because I loved him. Now, he was cute. She said, but I married him because I knew he would be a good provider. And that's what she saw in him, stability, someone who would provide and take care of the home. And my grandfather was like the unofficial mayor for the black side of town in Goldsboro, North Carolina, because Goldsboro was divided by a railroad track. And so I grew up in a black community there. Everything I saw looked like me. I mean, honestly, if someone white came through, all heads,
double take.
like what? I mean,
So
even no police officers, because they only sent the black officers over there when something happened. So I didn't see that. So I knew the reality of growing up and seeing all economic spectrums living in the same community, just streets over from each other. So everything from the actual principal at the school lived down the street to the most prominent attorney lived down the street. So we were all in this black incubator. We loved it. Only thing that was not black owned was the county rec center, the public library, but it was still run by those who look like me.
I don't know how to necessarily weave these two together, but just listening to you talk, I want to interject the word, your grandfather being a race man, whether or not that's an accurate description, and then also integration, segregation, pluses or minuses, pros and cons. So take that and unpack that however you want to, those two things, your grandfather being a race man and the impact of racism, desegregation in the 1950s and 60s.
Only cons, no pros. It didn't benefit us at all. As for example, if you go to Goldsboro, down the street from my grandparents' house is old high school, right? And this building was just sitting there, and eventually, fraternities came and they got together and bought it. Now they use it as an event space, so on and so forth. But we allowed the educational institution to close, to go to school somewhere else. We had space.
Right.
Now fast forward 2021, we're running around here. You're in the game. We're running around here looking for space in black space. We're looking to control these institutions
that we had. So we've been hoodwinked by professional hoods.
Absolutely. So that's going back to miseducation.
Yes.
That no one did a critical analysis of how this was going to impact us long term.
Again, there's so much to cover. I know we're not going to have enough. In the 50s, even in the 60s, there were pictures of, and you can Google them and find where it's I am a man, I am a man. What are your take on having to wear a sign proclaiming someone that I am a man?
Yeah, I get it, and no disrespect to those ancestors. I'm a revolutionary, so I come from that cloth.
Power concedes nothing without demand.
Absolutely, I wouldn't have been out there. Who are you? It's just like now when we talk about changing the narrative. Whose narrative? I never had none of these narratives about black life that most people are trying to undo. When you say Black Lives Matter, who are you talking to? Right? Who are you trying to
convince? Right?
Like my father used to, when I say stuff over and over again, my father used to say, who are you trying to convince, me or you? Right? So we're not sure that Black Lives Matter. So it's more of, even when we holler black power, no group that actually has power yells it.
Yeah.
Right? So it becomes more of a cry and a plea to the heavens for what we're absent of than what we actually have. Right? And so, as Kwame Ture says, that we want power. We don't want fortune. We don't want fame. We want power. And so we have to organize ourselves for power.
We titled this program, we're Cultivating Boys, Black Boys to Men. And that was kind of a little wink and a nod to the group, Boys to Men. But in that same meeting, we got into this conversation that was kind of tiptoed around. And when we talk about culture and canceling culture, there's a certain group or lifestyle that has kind of maybe hijacked what it is to be a man. So how does the African community, African culture throughout the diaspora embrace those people who says, look, I want you to call me as I see myself, regardless of how I was born or what I choose to identify myself as. Do you invite those individuals into this culture of manhood?
Yeah, so that's a good question. One of the things I want to be very, very clear on, I come from the standpoint of a Pan-Africanist nationalist revolutionary, right? So my worldview, my views and opinions are not based on just me personally. It's based on my ideologies, right? And so my ideology respects, defends, and enforces the institution of the nuclear family, period.
That's first.
Period. Nothing else. So if it doesn't add value to the idea of the nuclear family, it has no place in this culture. I'm not saying there's not a culture out there for it. We got to understand that we're not a monolith, and all culture identification won't be across the board. And that's why it's important when we do have gatherings, we come together, that we do a clear evaluation of who's in the room. Because if we believe just because we're all black, we believe because we all agree that we're suffering, things need to change, that we all the same, and we're not. We don't all have the same end game. And so our end games will separate the wheat from the chaff, as they say. And so in my cultural identification, there's no place, there's no room for that. And so it doesn't add value to my culture. It doesn't help my culture grow stronger. It doesn't help my culture even reproduce itself. And so all genes, right? All things on this planet, from bacteria to everything, wants to reproduce and grow. And not just grow stronger.
Multiply.
Adapt, adjust, prevail. That's nature. And if it doesn't do that, then there's no place in my culture.
So this may or may not be a stretch, but weave in the Crest theory, Dr. Francis Crest Welsing's work, the ISIS papers, as well as the original document, the Crest theory of color confrontation, racism, and white supremacy, with what you just said about, we have to procreate our race.
Yes. Not even just our race, an ideology. So when you talk about counseling culture, let's deal with it from its highest form. The enslavement of African people, the colonization of African people, was the greatest example of counseling out a culture in the history of the world. Right? A people, a group that have no culture identification. So we created one. Even the identification with black and what black means.
The word black, okay?
And what black means to us, right, is a hybrid of something, right? It's a mixture of all these African groups that were forced together, indigenous groups that were here that then became forced in with those black Africans. None of us could say out loud who we were. Code switching saved your life. And so that we had to modify our culture to fit our geography and our need to survive what was going on in the environment, right? And so this is what became black culture. And it's rooted in African culture. It's rooted in indigenous culture. That's why there was a time we can say, oh, somebody shot up the mall. Well, nobody
black. You
automatically
know.
But now those lines are blurred. Baby got found in the trash can. Won't one of ours, because we gladly get that baby to grandma or go down south, raise that baby, use up north, whatever it was. But the baby going in the trash can,
that wasn't our work.
That wasn't a cultural norm.
And so even when they were talking about the DC sniper going around, people were just like, no way.
Listen, when we found out that was a brother, we was all thrown off.
Oh, man.
What in the world? When we started doing that?
Yeah.
And so that goes back to W.E.B. Nova's point. When you take on another people's culture, the longer we identify with this culture group and this Eurocentric culture, we become more like them. Think about it. This whole idea of what we attempt for many of us is to become recognized. That's what Black Lives Matter is. I want you to recognize my humanity, right, and accept me as an honorary member of this culture that we live in, and we shouldn't want any parts of it. It's parasitic and it's destructive.
I just thought about the Atlanta child murders. Remember that?
Yeah.
You know,
I'm still not sure about that one.
And that's my point. Is that you're still not sure. Here, decades later, Wayne Williams, you know, still not sure about it.
Yeah.
Because it just didn't seem like that was something that.
But we had them. Listen, hearing Wallace right here in Charlotte was very real.
The proof, yes.
That actually happened.
Yes.
And so we are becoming more like the thing that we were trying to escape.
Yeah. But that speaks to your point about if he actually existed, what made him exist?
So that's an excellent point. I watched this game documentary once, and the interviewer was saying to this one young man how the community says he's responsible for the killings and the violence. And he said, okay, let's just say I am. I'll take responsibility for
what created
that.
me.
But what created me? Who's going to take responsibility for me? And that was an eye-awakening moment for me to really give that some critical analysis.
That's where Wellstein works come in too.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
Man, there's still so much that we need to cover. In your presentation, you talked about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And you kind of ended with him. Now, a lot of people like to put Martin Luther King in this, early '60s point where I have a dream and I've been to the mountaintop. Yeah. There's some footage out there with Dr. King in the late '60s, before he was assassinated, where he kind of, made comments, and this is on video, where he talks about, my words, not his. Well, maybe I didn't quite put that the way. Now that I've kind of grown, I see things a little bit different. Yeah. That's the King that very few people know. So you found some kind of way and some reason to incorporate that in your presentation.
Absolutely.
Talk about King.
One of the things I want to say, not just about King, but any man, any woman, is we grow.
Okay.
We evolve.
Yeah.
If you listen to me,
absolutely.
If you listen to me in the early '90s versus now, totally different guy. And so Dr. King evolved, and one of the greatest things he gave us was an understanding of those axes of evil.
Dig that. Well, my brother, believe it or not, I could ask, we could make this a 2-hour program, but we're going to have to kind of put a pin into there. Okay. Any final comments you may want to share with our viewers? I want to give that to you before I give you an opportunity to participate in our little ritual, which we call the eating of the chocolates.
So I wanted to focus on 2 things that we have to find solutions for, right? White hegemony and the massive redistribution of wealth.
Okay.
Not just wealth. Resources.
Okay. Good deal. All right, my brother. Adrian Sundiata, it has been a pleasure and honor. And as always, you have an opportunity to participate in the ritual we call the eating of the chocolates.
All right, brother.
My name is Chocolate Drop. I'd like to encourage our viewers to tune in each week, same day, to the same channel, for another fascinating episode of the Chocolate Box. I was going to say the Black Agenda. Man, I have done the Black Agenda about, 20 years, 30 years. But I see the sign, so I have 15 minutes left, so I'm wondering why. Okay. Tune in next week, same day, same time, for another fascinating episode of the Chocolate Box Presents. We'll see you then.